The first step when factoring a trinomial to a binomial is labeling your A, your B, and your C. So A would be 1, B would be 13, and C would be 40. Next, I find it's easier to solve later with the numbers written out in what's called the big X, the top section representing A multiplied by C, here right now, and then the bottom being B. The side two areas are special numbers. For the sake of clarity, I will refer to them as D and as E. These numbers are special because they add together to get the bottom section. I'll write that out. Bottom, which is just B, and they multiply together to get the top area, which is A times C. Then I rewrite the X now that I have the correct numbers instead of the variables in place, except for D and E, which we have not solved for yet. Top section being 40 because 1 times 40 is 40, and the bottom section being 13 because B is 13. Now we have to solve for our D and E. Now that we know what the products are, D plus E will equal 13, and D times E will equal 40. Now there are an infinite number of equations to equal 13, but there are finite numbers of things to multiply together to get 40, so I find it easy to write out its factors. 1 and 40, 2 and 20, 4 and 10, and 5 and 8. We know that these will all multiply together to equal 40. We have to add them together to see which one equals 13. 40 and 1 is 41, 2 and 20 is 22, 4 and 10 is 14, and 5 and 8 is 13. So we have our number. Now we can confirm this by rewriting it, saying 5 times 8 is 40, and 5 plus 8 equals 13. So our D and E variables are now 5 and 8. Now the next step is going to be splitting up our trinomial into two binomials, so then we can figure out what our solution will be. We're splitting up the entire trinomial, but we're mostly focusing on the 13, which we just split into 5 and 8. So we will bring it down into 2. Factoring is a multi-step process, and sometimes it can get confusing to know which numbers go where, so I find it's easy to write parentheses before I even know what's going to be in them. Then I will bring down my first term into the first parentheses, n squared, and then I will bring down my 5 because that is the first broken piece of 13, 5n. 5 will go there, and 8 will go over here. So 8n will now be placed as the first term in the second binomial, then doing the same thing and bringing down the 40. The next step is very important, but luckily there are ways to check to see if we do it correctly. Within each binomial, we have to figure out what the greatest common factor is, so the highest number that both terms can be divided by. In the first parentheses, it would be n, so they can both divide and give up an n, and that's the highest that it can go. In the second one, that would be 8, because the 40 doesn't have an n to be divided by. We can now begin rewriting our equations after they've been divided, starting with the number that we divided them by, which will always be outside of the parentheses. So n will go first. After n squared plus 5n being divided, you will get n plus 5. Doing the same thing on the other side by beginning to place our 8, and then inside the parentheses putting the solutions. So 8n divided by 8 would simply be n, and 40 divided by 8 would be 5. We can check to see if we did this step properly is that the parentheses should be exactly the same. If they're not, you might have to check and see if your greatest common factor was correct. Now again, we have to rewrite the equation. I'm going to move this up just a little bit so I have more room to write. But we can get rid of one of the n plus 5 because we have 2 of them, so we don't need both. And we can bring that one down as our second binomial. Then we can combine our, I'll rewrite this. Next, we actually combine our greatest common factors into the first parentheses just by adding them together, so n plus 8. At first, I noticed that in this trinomial, the numbers are pretty big and hard to work with, so I'd rather divide them into 2 and make them smaller. So it would be 9x squared plus 29x plus 6. Now we can label our A, B, and C.
A being 9, B being 29, because you don't count the variable, and C being 6. Now we can make our big X again, so it is easier to lay out our numbers later on, with our imaginary D and E. And the top, since it's A times C, it will be 9 times 6, or 6 times 9, which would make the top box 54, and the bottom 29. Now we need to figure out what adds together to get 29, and multiplies together to get 54. Now again, anything can add together to get 29, but only certain things can multiply together, whole numbers I mean, to get 54. There's 1 and 54, 2 and 27, 3 and 18, 6 and 9. Now add them all together, 1 and 54 to get 55, and then 27 plus 2 would get you 29, which is our answer, but it's good to check all of them. So now we know that our special numbers, D and E, will be 2 and 27. Now we can begin to break up our equation again. Once again, revolving around that 29, which we split into 2 and 27. Now you have to remember there should be a 2 on the outside, because that's what we originally divided it by. Splitting the 2 that way and the 27 that way. Bring down the n squared and x squared plus 2x, and the 27x plus 6. Now we have to find our greatest common factor, and here's on a bigger screen. So here it would be x, and here it would be 3. So that just turns into x on the outside, and then 3x plus, that should just be an x. 9x plus 2, and 3 on the outside, so 9x plus 2, and we know that they are the same because they are both 9x plus 2, so we did something right. We can get rid of one of them and bring down the other because they are the same. So 9x plus 2 in one binomial, and x plus 3 in the other. Now we're not done yet because we haven't brought down the 2, because that was our original greatest common factor. And that is your answer.
Here I just begin by writing out the things that we're about to fill in, just so it's easier to keep your mind on track as to what you're supposed to be writing in. So that was our big X with our D and E, A and C and B. And that's what we're going to be filling in. But these numbers are pretty big, so I would rather work with smaller numbers, and we can divide all of them by their greatest common factor, which would be 6, I believe. And now we can rewrite our equation. 3b squared plus 23b plus 14. And remembering the 6 on the outside, because that is our greatest common factor that we divided by, so we can't just get rid of it, we have to put it somewhere, and we will put it at the end of our equation later. So A is 3, B is 23, C is 14, and since our top box is A times C, the top would be 42 and the bottom would be 23 since it's B. So now we have to figure out what added together would equal 23 and multiplied together would equal 42. And again, since you could add anything together to get 23, we're not going to figure out all of those things, just figuring out what would multiply together to get 42. 42 and 1, 2 and 2, 21 and 2, 14 and 3, and 7 and 6.
now I'm adding them all together. And I think it's just good to add them all, even though the 21 and 2 do seem to be the ones that work in our favor for what adds into 23. So now we know that those are going to be our special magic numbers. Check that, because 21 times 2 is 42. 21 plus 2 is 23. Now we can begin to split our equation with the 23 going in 21 and 2. That's how it's being broken apart. Here. And you just bring down the 3b squared, and you split the 23b in the two numbers that we created. It doesn't matter the order, whether you put the 2 over there, the 21 there. It really doesn't matter. Plus 14 with the 6 on the outside, but you don't need to write that in yet because we aren't using that until our final answer. Now we need to find the greatest common factor, which would be 3b, because they both can be divided by 3 and b, and they cannot be divided by b, so the highest would be 2. And again, when you divide something, you have to put the number that you divided by on the outside, so 3b parentheses b plus 7, and then you'd have here I'm changing colors, 2 on the outside and b plus 7, and they're exactly the same. So that is the way that you're supposed to check at this stage to see if you are on the right path, and it seems like we are. So we can get rid of one and move down the other. So b plus 7. And then combining the greatest common factor, so 3b and 2. Over here at that arrow. Here, I just rewrite it here. And remember, we had that 6 from when we originally divided it. So now that